The time had finally come for us to pack our things and embark on the long-awaited journey. This trip to visit the indigenous people had been in the making for over a year, its details etched into the back of our minds, always postponed by life's endless interruptions. Between work, family commitments, and the usual excuses, the trip had become something of a distant dream. But now, standing by the door with our bags packed and passports in hand, the day had arrived. My wife, Isabelle, was beaming with excitement, her hazel eyes bright with the curiosity she'd always had for adventure. I, on the other hand, felt an odd sense of relief that we were finally doing this. Not that I wasn't excited. But I had a strange unease clinging to me ever since we had booked the tickets. Maybe it was the fact that we had been postponing it so many times. A part of me wondered if that delay had been some subconscious sign, a warning to stay home, but Isabelle's enthusiasm was contagious, and I wasn't about to spoil her mood. The drive to the airport was uneventful, the early morning sun rising in the distance as we slipped through the streets. Our long-haul flight stretched on, testing the limits of our patience, each passing hour making me more restless. Isabelle, on the other hand, looked more vibrant with each minute, lost in her thoughts about the culture we were about to immerse ourselves in. When we finally touched down, the weight of the travel began to hit us. Our guide, a man named Raphael, met us at the terminal, his weathered face framed by dark hair that hung just below his ears. His warm smile and energetic handshake made me feel a little more at ease, though the exhaustion of the journey was catching up. The trek was far from over. A long drive awaited us, cutting through narrow dirt roads surrounded by endless stretches of jungle. And then there was the boat ride. Isabelle didn't seem to mind the ride, chatting with Raphael as he guided the boat across the choppy water. She had always been the more social of the two of us, easily slipping into conversations with strangers as if they were old friends. I sat back, watching the sky darken as we moved deeper into the unknown. The endless hum of the boat's engine became a sort of hypnotic rhythm, pulling me further into my thoughts. I had been anticipating this trip with mixed emotions for some time. It was supposed to be a journey of discovery, of cultural immersion, a chance to escape the familiar and step into something new. Yet, now that we were here, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling of discomfort. It wasn't fear exactly. Maybe it was the unfamiliar surroundings, or maybe it was just the fatigue from the grueling 16 hours of travel. But there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the island came into view. The lights of the small village flickered in the distance as the boat slowed, cutting through the still waters as we neared the shore. Raphael smiled again, a knowing look in his eyes. "You'll love it here," he said, his voice full of the kind of confidence only a local could have. But as the boat gently bumped against the dock, I felt a strange twinge of hesitation. The air was thick with humidity, the oppressive kind that clung to your skin. The jungle seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the night in its depths. Isabelle, however, was undeterred. She practically bounded off the boat, her enthusiasm undimmed by the long journey. Raphael gestured toward the small huts in the distance. "It's a long trip, I know. You two must be exhausted. We can rest tonight and meet the villagers tomorrow." Relief washed over me as I nodded, too tired to argue. Isabelle hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the direction of the village. "Maybe we could just—" "No," I interrupted, giving her a weak smile. "Let's rest. It's been a long day." The guide laughed softly. "You'll have plenty of time tomorrow," he said, leading us toward the simple lodging prepared for us. The night was settling in, the sounds of the jungle coming alive with every step we took. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the calls of distant animals, and despite my exhaustion, it was impossible not to be captivated by the world around us. By the time we reached our room, I was too drained to care about anything else. The bed was far from luxurious, but at that moment it was all I needed. Isabelle slipped in beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Tomorrow's going to be amazing," she whispered, her voice full of anticipation. I wanted to match her excitement, to share in the moment, but as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the unease that had been lingering at the edges of my thoughts all day was now in full force, gnawing at me in the darkness. Isabelle drifted off to sleep quickly, her soft breathing filling the room. But I stayed awake, my mind restless. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, everything would feel right again. But the morning came earlier than I expected. We were jolted awake by the booming sound of drums reverberating through the walls of our small hut. I groaned, trying to bury my face in the pillow, but the noise was relentless. Drums, shouts, and laughter filled the air. I glanced at the clock. It was barely 6 a.m. Isabelle stirred beside me, her hair a tangled mess from the night's rest. She groggily rubbed her eyes and sat up, casting a curious look toward the noise outside. "They're starting early," she said with a sleepy smile. She was clearly excited. I, on the other hand, wasn't quite as eager to leave the bed, but there was no avoiding it. The sounds of the ritual were inescapable. We both dragged ourselves out of bed, stepping out into the humid morning air to witness what awaited us. The scene before us was unlike anything I had ever seen. A large group of the indigenous people, entirely naked, were dancing around a massive fire, their bodies covered in layers of mud and bright pigments. They moved in sync, their arms raised, their feet stomping the earth in time with the rhythm of the drums. Their voices rang out in strange chants, echoing through the jungle, mixing with the sounds of nature. I glanced at Isabelle, who watched with wide eyes, completely transfixed by the ritual unfolding before us. The raw energy of the scene was captivating, yes, but also unnerving. I was not used to such primal displays. They were naked, their bodies moving without a hint of shame, completely immersed in their world. I felt out of place, like a spectator in a reality I wasn't meant to understand. Before we had the chance to process it all, several of them approached us. One of the women, with bright red markings painted on her face, grabbed Isabelle's arm gently, smiling as she led her toward the center of the circle. Isabelle glanced back at me, excitement radiating from her eyes. I hesitated for a moment before following her. They guided us into the center of the ritual, smearing mud across our faces and arms, their voices rising in a chant that felt ancient and powerful. The sensation of the cool mud on my skin was strange, but somehow calming. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the rhythm of the ceremony made it feel as though we were being welcomed into something sacred, something old. I tried to embrace the experience, but my mind kept wandering, a nagging discomfort pulling at the edges of my thoughts. There was something about the ritual, about the way they moved, that felt intense, like there was something deeper going on, something that escaped my comprehension. The ceremony seemed to last for hours, though it was probably only minutes. By the time it ended, the sun was high in the sky, and my stomach growled in protest. Raphael, our guide, appeared at our side with a grin. "Come, it's time for breakfast. You're in for a treat," he said, leading us toward the communal area. I wish I could say I was prepared for what awaited us, but nothing could have prepared me for this. Plates of food were laid out, and among the offerings were fried maggots, large and crispy, their shiny bodies stacked in neat piles. The sight alone made my stomach turn. I could see the unease on Isabelle's face as well. She looked at me, her expression full of silent pleading, hoping I'd take the lead and refuse for both of us. Raphael, however, picked up a handful of the maggots without hesitation, popping them into his mouth as though they were nothing more than potato chips. He smiled as he chewed, clearly accustomed to the delicacy. The villagers, watching us with expectant eyes, waited for us to follow suit. "I can't," Isabelle whispered, her voice trembling. "I just can't." I was about to decline politely when one of the indigenous women handed Isabelle a small plate with a few maggots on it, her eyes bright and encouraging. Isabelle, always determined to embrace new cultures, tried to swallow her hesitation. She picked one up, her hand shaking slightly, and hesitantly placed it in her mouth. The result was immediate. Her face twisted in disgust, her body recoiling as the taste hit her. She dropped the plate and covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. I can't, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry, I can't. Without another word, she turned and fled from the table, her hand pressed against her stomach, fighting the nausea that had overwhelmed her. Raphael smiled sympathetically, though the villagers seemed unfazed. I quickly excused myself and followed Isabelle back to the hut, where she collapsed onto the bed, her face pale. I just need to lie down, she murmured, closing her eyes. I sat beside her, my hand resting lightly on her arm, unsure of what to say. We had both been thrown into a world that was far more unfamiliar than we had expected. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, her breathing steady. I watched her for a few moments, exhaustion weighing heavily on me. My own eyes began to droop, and before I knew it, I had slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke, hours had passed. The light in the room had changed, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. I stretched, glancing over to where Isabelle had been lying. The bed was empty. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and called out her name, but there was no response. The room was eerily quiet. At first, I assumed she had stepped out for some fresh air, maybe to talk with Raphael or mingle with the villagers. I wasn't too concerned. Isabelle had always been more adventurous, more eager to immerse herself in new experiences. Still, as the minutes ticked by, a sense of unease began to creep into my mind. Where was she? I left the hut and began to search the village. The air felt heavier than before, and I noticed that most of the villagers had disappeared. Only a few women remained, sitting quietly near the fire, weaving baskets. The drums had stopped. The vibrant energy from the morning was gone, replaced by an unsettling calm. My chest tightened as I wandered from hut to hut, calling out Isabelle's name. But the response was the same, silence. No one seemed to understand me. Or maybe they did and simply didn't want to answer. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Where was Raphael? Where were the rest of the villagers? I tried asking the few women who remained, but they only looked at me with blank, unreadable expressions. My attempts to communicate were futile. I was a stranger in a foreign world, lost without the language or the means to make sense of what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts racing in a dozen different directions, none of them good. What if something had happened to her? What if she was hurt? What if no, I couldn't think like that. I needed to stay calm, but it was getting harder by the second. I searched every hut, my mind filling with more desperate thoughts as I pushed back the rising tide of fear. But she was nowhere. Isabelle was gone. I didn't waste another second. Isabelle had vanished, and the village felt eerily empty, as though something sinister had swept through and silenced everything. With every passing moment, my unease grew, twisting into full-blown panic. I had to find her, and the only place left to search was the dense, suffocating forest beyond the village. My heart hammered as I pushed through the thick underbrush, the path ahead barely visible through the tangle of vines and roots. As I walked deeper into the forest, the air became heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The only sounds were the occasional calls of distant animals and the crunch of my footsteps on the forest floor. But then, faintly at first, I began to hear something, drums rhythmic and hauntingly familiar. My heart skipped a beat. Was it another ritual? Maybe Isabelle had found her way there, swept up in another ceremony, oblivious to the fact that I had been searching for her. The sounds grew louder, more defined. And then, mingled with the beat of the drums, I heard something else, laughter, shouts, and a scream. My blood froze in my veins. The scream was unmistakable, high-pitched, panicked, and filled with a tone I knew all too well. Isabelle. I broke into a run, branches whipping in my face as I barreled through the undergrowth, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she hurt? Was she in danger? I called her name, my voice drowned out by the relentless drums and cries, my fear mounting with every step. And then, just as I reached a small clearing, I saw her. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the scene unfolded before my eyes. Isabelle, my wife, was completely naked, her body smeared with the same mud from the morning ritual. But this wasn't some sacred ceremony. She was surrounded by the indigenous men, their bodies pressed against hers in a grotesque display of violation. They moved around her like predators, their hands gripping her, their faces contorted in a frenzy of primal lust. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The woman who had laughed with me, shared my bed, my life, was now this? No! I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat before I could stop it. What are you doing? Stop! That's my wife! But no one stopped. My voice seemed to vanish into the madness surrounding me, swallowed by the drums and chants. I lurched forward, my fists clenched, ready to tear them away from her, to pull her to safety. But before I could take another step, I felt a hand clamp down on my arm, yanking me back. It was Raphael, the guide. His face was grim, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. "Stop! Don't move," he hissed, his voice low but filled with warning. "They might turn on you if you interfere." I shook my head, fury and confusion boiling over. "Are you insane? They're raping her. I have to." "No," he interrupted sharply, his grip tightening. "You don't understand. If you provoke them, they could kill you. They could kill both of you." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind struggling to comprehend his words. I remembered the warnings we'd received before coming here, the whispers about how unpredictable the tribe could be. But none of that had prepared me for this. None of that had suggested that something so horrific could happen. Tears burned my eyes as I looked back at the scene, my heart tearing apart at the sight. Isabelle. How could this happen? How could they do this to her? But then something shifted. I saw it in the way she moved, the way her body responded to their touch. At first, I thought she was struggling, but as I watched more closely, the truth began to sink in, a truth I wasn't prepared for. She wasn't resisting. In fact, there was no trace of struggle in her at all. Her head was tilted back, her eyes half closed, her lips parted. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking uncontrollably. No, this can't be real. They didn't force her. Raphael's voice broke through the fog of my shock. His words were calm, but heavy, each one landing like a blow. She chose this. I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "She asked to join them," Raphael said, his eyes avoiding mine. "This is part of their ritual. Some outsiders, they're drawn to it. She wanted to be part of it." I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the very earth was crumbling away. She wanted this? My voice cracked, disbelief and rage swirling inside me. "You're lying?" But Raphael didn't flinch. She approached them on her own. She wasn't forced. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. Isabelle, my wife, hadn't been dragged into this ritual unwillingly. She had chosen it. I looked back at her, my vision blurring with tears, and in that moment, something shattered inside me. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself. It was in the choice, in the fact that she had made the decision to do this, knowing full well what it would mean, knowing what it would do to me. A scream clawed its way up from the pit of my stomach, but I swallowed it, the taste of bile thick in my throat. I wanted to tear the world apart, to rip these men away from her, to shake her and demand an answer to the question that burned in my mind. Why? But I couldn't move. Raphael's hand remained on my arm, grounding me into reality of the situation. If I did anything, if I so much as took a step forward, I would die. And Isabelle, I didn't know what would happen to her, but in that moment, a part of me didn't care. I stood there, powerless, watching as my wife, the woman I had loved, laughed with, planned my future with, let herself be consumed by something darker, something I couldn't understand. The tears fell freely now, hot and silent, as I watched the scene play out before me. It felt like an eternity before it was over. The men slowly peeled away from her, their eyes still wild with the remnants of the ritual. Isabelle remained on the ground, her body limp, her breath ragged. For a brief moment, our eyes met, hers filled with something I couldn't place. Was it shame? Defiance? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. All I could feel was rage and betrayal. Without a word, Raphael led me back toward the village, my feet moving automatically as though they weren't mine. Everything felt surreal, like I was walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My hands still trembled, my heart racing with a mixture of fury and devastation. How could she? After everything we had been through, after all the trust, the promises, how could she betray me like this? I stormed back into the hut, my heart pounding in my chest, anger burning through my veins. The moment I crossed the threshold, I began throwing my belongings into my bag, my hands shaking with rage. I needed to get out of here. Every breath I took felt suffocating. Every second spent in this place was another stab to my soul. I couldn't believe what I had seen, what Isabelle had done. As I packed in a frenzy, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart sank when I realized who it was. I turned slowly to see her standing in the doorway, not alone, but with the same indigenous men from earlier. They hovered behind her, their faces unreadable, their presence unnerving. Isabelle, however, wore an expression of calm that sent a new wave of fury through me. How could she be so composed after everything? How could she stand there, so indifferent, after shattering my world? "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice steady, as though we were just having another mundane argument. I couldn't hold back. "What am I doing?" I spat, my voice rising. "What are you doing, Isabelle? Why? Why did you do this? Why did you betray me with them?" My voice echoed in the small space, but she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even seem affected. Instead, she stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression cold, distant, like she had already moved on from whatever this was between us. "I wanted to experience it," she said simply. "It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Her words hit me like a slap across the face. I stood there, stunned, struggling to process what she was saying. Experience it? A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? My mind reeled at her casual explanation, at the way she talked about it, as though she had just taken a hike or tried some exotic food, something insignificant. What kind of stupidity is this? I yelled, my throat tight with emotion. Who the hell did I marry? What happened to you? But still, there was no reaction, no guilt, no remorse. She stood there, her gaze unwavering, as if she didn't care how much she had hurt me, how much damage she had done. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. I grabbed my things and turned to leave, pushing past her as though she were a stranger. "I'm leaving," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "I can't stay here. Not after this." I reached the boat and was getting on before Raphael, the guide, caught up with me, his face clouded with worry. "You're not going anywhere without us," he said firmly, stepping in front of me. "How do you expect to get back home without your wife? We're in the middle of the jungle." I stopped, my fists clenching at my sides. His words made sense, but I didn't care. I didn't want to hear it. "That's your problem now?" I snapped, shoving past him. But Raphael wasn't having it. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight, his voice low and angry. "You're not leaving. Got it?" I yanked my arm free and shoved him hard, my frustration spilling over. Because of the mud, he slipped and fell to the ground, cursing as he scrambled back to his feet. And that was it. The tension that had been simmering between us boiled over, and before I knew it, we were on each other. He lunged at me, and I met him with equal force, our fists flying as we crashed into the mud. We rolled through the muck, punching, kicking, both of us too blinded by anger to notice anything else. I don't know how long we fought, but the boat was far enough from the village that no one heard us. My body ached, my knuckles raw from the fight, but I couldn't stop. Every punch, every strike was a release, a way to pour out all the rage, the betrayal, the hurt that had been festering inside me. Raphael's words, Isabelle's indifference, everything boiled together into one primal instinct: to hurt, to destroy. And then out of nowhere, I heard it, the sound of loud cries. My body froze, my fists still clenched as I looked up. Emerging from the jungle, a group of indigenous men ran toward us, their faces fierce, spears raised high above their heads. My heart dropped. Before I could react, they surrounded us, their shouts piercing the air. The men were large, their muscular bodies painted with the same mud that had covered Isabelle. They grabbed me roughly, their hands like iron, tying my wrists with thick ropes before I could protest. I tried to struggle, but it was useless. They were too strong, too fast. Raphael yelled something in their language, his voice urgent. But I couldn't understand him. I couldn't understand any of it. The men barked commands at one another, their voices sharp and filled with authority. And then, without a word, they lifted me off the ground and began to carry me away. "No!" I shouted, panic surging through me. "What are you doing? Let me go!" But they didn't respond. They marched forward, their pace steady, their grip unyielding as they dragged me deeper into the jungle. Raphael followed behind, shouting something I couldn't make out, his face twisted with worry. I didn't know what he was saying, but the fear in his eyes was enough to send chills down my spine. They took me to a swamp, the thick, murky water glistening in the dim light of the setting sun. The smell of decay filled the air, the scent of rot clinging to my nostrils as they tied me to a large tree at the edge of the water. My body was soaked with mud, my chest heaving as I struggled against the bindings. I screamed at them, cursed them, but they paid no attention. They moved with purpose, their eyes cold and focused as they secured me to the trunk, my back pressed against the rough bark. Raphael spoke to them in a hurried tone, his words rushed and frantic. I could only catch fragments of what was happening. He gestured wildly, pointing toward me, then back toward the village, but the men didn't seem to care. They left me there, tied and helpless, their faces grim as they turned and disappeared into the forest. For a moment, there was silence. Just the distant hum of the jungle, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. And then I saw them, crocodile eyes. They glinted in the swamp's murky water, barely visible at first, but unmistakable. The creatures lurked just beneath the surface, their massive bodies hidden from view, but their presence was clear. My breath caught in my throat as the reality of my situation sank in. I was tied to a tree in a swamp, surrounded by predators that could tear me apart in an instant. Fear gripped me, colder and more vicious than the rage I had felt earlier. Isabelle's betrayal, Raphael's warning, the indigenous men. It all faded into the background as I stared at those eyes, knowing that one wrong move, one noise, could trigger an attack. I was trapped, helpless and alone. I was tied to the tree, my body trembling uncontrollably as the reality of my situation sank in. The crocodile's eyes glinted in the swamp's murky water, unblinking, its enormous head barely visible above the surface. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was certain this was it, the end. I was going to die here, alone, in the middle of this godforsaken jungle, torn apart by this beast. But the crocodile didn't move. It just stared at me calm, almost indifferent. I didn't dare make a sound, my breath shallow, as I tried to remain perfectly still, hoping beyond hope that it would lose interest. The minutes stretched into hours, and I felt the panic drain from my body, replaced by a hollow, numb terror. I couldn't feel my hands anymore. They were too tightly bound to the tree, the ropes cutting into my wrists. My muscles ached, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, but I couldn't allow myself to pass out. I had to stay alert, even if there was no one left to save me. The jungle around me hummed with life, but it all felt distant, muted. I stared at the crocodile, and it stared back, an unspoken, understanding passing between us. We were both creatures trapped in a moment, waiting. I wasn't sure for what. I don't know how long I hung there, the swamp water lapping at my feet, the cool night air creeping through the trees, but at some point, I saw movement. One of the indigenous men emerged from the shadows, his bare feet moving silently over the damp earth. He walked toward me slowly, his expression unreadable, the painted mud still clinging to his skin from the ritual earlier. I flinched as he approached, unsure of what was coming next. He said something in his language, his voice soft but firm, the words lost on me. I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak, my fear too great to make sense of anything. He pulled out a stone knife, the sharp edge glinting faintly in the moonlight. My heart lurched. Was this it? Would he finish what the crocodile hadn't? But instead, he stepped closer and began cutting the rope that held me. The blade sliced through the bindings with ease, and after what felt like an eternity, I was free. I crumpled to the ground, my legs too weak to hold me, my body aching from the hours spent tied to the tree. I looked up at him, bewildered, but he didn't meet my eyes. He simply motioned for me to follow him. I had no other choice. My mind was too foggy, too drained to resist. I stumbled after him, my body screaming with every step. He led me through the jungle, back toward the boat, the same one that had brought me and Isabelle to this nightmare of a place. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Why was he letting me go? Why now? I didn't know the answers, and at that moment, I didn't care. When we reached the boat, the man stopped, nodding toward it, and then disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, shaking from head to toe. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape before something else happened, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my thoughts swirling with images of Isabelle, of the ritual, of the men surrounding her. But I had to go. I couldn't stay here any longer. I scrambled into the boat, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the oars. The thought of staying behind, of facing any of them again, terrified me to my core. I pushed out from the shore, rowing as fast as I could, casting nervous glances over my shoulder to make sure no one was following. The jungle loomed large behind me, and the quiet hum of life from the swamp felt suffocating, as though the very trees were closing in on me. The motor sputtered to life, and I pushed forward, navigating through the dark water, but my mind was spinning with too much dread to notice my surroundings. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't focus. I just knew I needed to get away. My thoughts kept drifting back to what I'd witnessed, what Isabelle had done. Every stroke of the oar felt heavier than the last, as though my arms were made of lead, weighed down by the unbearable truth I could no longer deny. I had lost everything. My life, my marriage, my trust. It had all been torn apart in the most brutal way imaginable. I didn't even have the will to hate Isabelle at that moment. I was too numb to feel anything but hollow, consumed by the bleakness of what my life had become. After what felt like an eternity, the engine sputtered and died. I cursed under my breath, my hands shaking as I tried to restart it, but nothing worked. I was out of fuel. My heart sank. The darkness around me seemed to close in, the jungle watching with unseen eyes, waiting. I grabbed the oars, knowing I had no other option. I rowed for hours, my muscles aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every ripple in the water sent my heart racing. I passed through patches of darkness where the trees hung low, their branches casting eerie shapes on the water, and I imagined all kinds of horrors lurking beneath the surface. Anacondas, crocodiles, things far worse. I was lost, disoriented, the fear gnawing at me with every stroke. It wasn't until the faintest glow appeared on the horizon that I felt the smallest flicker of hope. There in the distance were the lights of a town, a lifeline. I rowed toward it, my body screaming in protest, my arms shaking uncontrollably. Each pull of the oar felt like it might be my last, my muscles burning with exhaustion. But I had to make it. I had to get away. As I neared the town, the lights grew brighter, but I felt no relief. The weight of what I'd lost was too heavy, too crushing. By the time I reached the shore, I was too drained to care about anything else. I tied the boat to a small dock and climbed out, my legs barely able to hold me up. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but I didn't have the energy to find help. I stumbled toward a bench in the town square, collapsing onto the cold wood, my entire body aching with exhaustion. I was soaked through, covered in mud and sweat, my clothes torn and clinging to my skin. The town felt surreal, like a distant dream I had fallen into after the nightmare of the jungle. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the memories of the island, the visions of Isabelle, the sound of Raphael's voice. Everything felt distant now, as though it had happened to someone else. But it hadn't. It had happened to me, and the weight of that truth pressed down on me like a boulder I could never lift. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out of a restless haze, haunted by the echoes of what had happened, too exhausted to process the depth of my loss. I had escaped, but what was left for me? I had no home, no wife, no life to go back to. By morning, I was too tired to feel anything. The next day felt like it was happening in a daze, as if the world around me had slowed down to a crawl. After waking up on the bench in the small town, I wandered the streets aimlessly until I found someone who let me borrow their phone. My hands shook as I dialed the number, praying my friend would pick up. When he finally answered, his voice filled with concern, I couldn't hold back. Everything I had bottled up came rushing out. Everything about Isabelle, the village, the ritual. I poured out the entire story, my voice trembling with every word. He was silent for a long time when I finished. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, trying to process what I had told him. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're lucky to be alive, man. I can't believe this happened." I heard the concern, the shock, the confusion. I felt all those things too, but mostly I just felt hollow. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I need to get out of here. I'll come get you," he said immediately. "Just hang in there. Stay where you are." I waited all day, sitting by the water, watching the boats drift in and out of the harbor. My mind was stuck on a loop, replaying the same scenes over and over again. Isabelle's laughter, the cold look in her eyes when I confronted her, the crocodile stare, Raphael's betrayal. Nothing made sense, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more lost I felt. I was haunted, trapped in a memory that wouldn't let me go. By the time my friend arrived late that night, I was so drained, I didn't even have the strength to cry anymore. Seeing him felt like a lifeline. He pulled me into a tight hug, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of warmth, a reminder that there was still a world outside of the nightmare I had just escaped from. We sat on the dock for hours, me retelling the story, his face pale with disbelief. "I don't know how you survived," he kept saying, shaking his head. "I can't imagine," he trailed off, unable to find the words. We booked tickets that night, not wanting to spend another moment in this cursed place. The flight home felt like an eternity, the weight of what I'd gone through pressing down on me, threatening to crush me with every passing hour. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. I stared out the window at the clouds below, my thoughts consumed by the images of Isabelle, her betrayal, the way she had calmly explained it all as if it were nothing. The woman I had married was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't sure I ever really knew. When we finally landed and drove back to my house, I felt a momentary sense of relief. The sight of my home, familiar and unchanged, gave me a fleeting feeling of comfort. I stumbled inside, not bothering to unpack, and collapsed on the bed. The exhaustion of the journey, the days of stress, the emotional devastation, it all caught up to me at once, and I slept for an entire day and night. But when I woke, the emptiness returned. The first thought that greeted me was Isabelle. Even though she had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way, I still found myself worrying about her. Was she still alive? Had something happened to her after I escaped? My mind couldn't let go of the possibility that she was still out there, and that I had left her behind. I couldn't understand why she had done it. What had driven her to such a dark, incomprehensible decision? I spent the entire day crying, the grief swallowing me whole. I regretted the trip more than I had regretted anything in my life. I had never imagined things would turn out this way. It was supposed to be an adventure, a journey into something unknown but safe, shared between the two of us. Instead, it had destroyed everything. In the days that followed, I realized I couldn't handle the weight of it all on my own. I began seeing a psychiatrist, desperate to make sense of the trauma that had shattered my life. Every day, I sat in that quiet office, talking through the pain, trying to understand, but no matter how many sessions I attended, no matter how many hours I spent going over the details, the memories of Isabelle and the island wouldn't leave me. Weeks passed, and still, there was no word from her. She had vanished without a trace. I checked the news, contacted authorities, and searched for any information that might give me a clue about what had happened after I left, but there was nothing. She was gone. The mystery of her disappearance gnawed at me, even as I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter anymore. She had made her choice. She had chosen them over me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I was still her husband, and I still cared, despite everything. I sank deeper into depression as the days dragged on. My mind became consumed by thoughts of her, of the island, of the nightmarish scene I had witnessed. I started taking sedatives to numb the constant anxiety that had taken root in my chest, but nothing seemed to help. The darkness inside me grew, spreading like a disease, until I could hardly function. Another month passed, and Isabelle was still missing. I couldn't stand it anymore. The thought of her, lost somewhere in the jungle, haunted me day and night. I found myself obsessing over the idea of going back to look for her, of finding out what had happened. Maybe she was still alive. Maybe there was a way to bring her home. My hair had started to turn gray, and I could see the strain on my face whenever I looked in the mirror. I had lost weight, the stress eating away at me from the inside. My friend visited me every day, doing his best to convince me not to go back. "It's suicide," he said. "You'll never make it out if you go back there. Let it go. She's gone." But I couldn't. The thought of returning to that island had taken root in my mind, growing stronger with every day that passed. Even though I knew it might cost me my life, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know the truth. The sedatives weren't working anymore. The sessions with my psychiatrist had become mechanical, the same conversations over and over, but they did nothing to ease the torment inside me. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world around me was slipping away, and all that was left was the gnawing need to find her. I didn't know what I would do if I went back. I didn't know if I would ever return. But I couldn't stay here, trapped in this endless cycle of regret and guilt. I had to go back, even if it meant losing. Now I'm finishing writing this and packing. I've decided that I will go there again. I have to find out where my wife is,